A life in the balance. The cold fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast a harsh glow on Dr. David Marshall's weary face as he leaned against the counter, flipping through yet another patient chart. It was close to midnight, and the ER was alive with its usual chaotic symphony. The high-pitched beeping of monitors, the shuffle of hurried footsteps, and the occasional distant cry of pain. But for David, the sounds blurred into a familiar white noise, a coping mechanism honed over decades of practice. Dr. Marshall called Linda, the senior ER nurse, her voice cutting through the haze of his thoughts. She handed him a fresh set of vitals for an incoming patient. Her sharp professional demeanor was softened by the faint concern in her eyes. "It's a rough one. Teen male, approximately 16. Paramedics suspect an overdose. They're bringing him in now." David sighed and nodded, brushing a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Let's get him stabilized," he said, his tone clinical and detached. But beneath the surface, a knot tightened in his chest, the way it always did when a young life hung in the balance. Seconds later, the double doors of the ER burst open with a rush of cold night air. Two paramedics wheeled in a gurney, their faces etched with urgency. "Male, 16, found unresponsive in Grant Park," one of them announced. "BP is 90/60, pulse weak and irregular. Suspected opioid overdose. Administered 1 dose of Narcan en route. He's breathing, but barely." David snapped into action, years of experience guiding his movements. "Bay 3, he ordered, already moving toward the treatment area. "Linda, prepare for intubation. Mike, get an IV started." The team worked in seamless coordination. David's hands were steady as he inserted the breathing tube, but his focus was razor-sharp. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. Every second lost was a step closer to the boy's life slipping away. "Push another dose of Narcan," David instructed, his eyes flicking to the heart monitor. The boy's oxygen levels were critically low, the jagged lines on the screen a stark reminder of how close to the edge he was. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the boy's chest rose with a deep, shuddering breath. His vitals began to stabilize, the grayish pallor of his skin fading to a healthier pink. Relief rippled through the room, though no one paused to celebrate. There were still too many unknowns. David leaned in to check the boy's pupils, but as his gaze fell on the boy's face, he froze. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. And for a moment, the cacophony of the ER faded into silence. This boy, this unconscious teenager, was the spitting image of his son. David staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the gurney to steady himself. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the dark hair that fell in messy waves across the boy's forehead and the faint scar above his left eyebrow. It was as if he were staring into the face of his son, Alex, who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. "Dr. Marshall." Linda's voice broke through his stupor, her eyes flicking between him and the patient with concern. "Are you all right?" David forced himself to nod, his throat too tight to speak. His hands trembled as he resumed his examination, but his mind was a whirlwind of emotions: grief, confusion, disbelief. It wasn't possible. And yet, as they moved the boy to a recovery room, David's gaze fell on something around the boy's neck, a silver necklace, partially hidden beneath his hospital gown. His breath caught as he gently lifted the chain to inspect it. Engraved on the pendant were 3 simple words: "Always with you." David's heart stopped. He knew that necklace. He'd given it to Alex on his 15th birthday, just months before the accident. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The way Alex had smiled when he opened the box, the way he'd worn it every day until the day he died. "How?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. He stared at the boy, his mind racing with questions. Who was this teenager? How had he come into possession of something so deeply personal? And why did he look so much like Alex? For the rest of his shift, David couldn't shake the image of the boy's face, or the impossible coincidence of the necklace. Even as the ER continued to hum with life around him, his thoughts kept circling back to the boy in the recovery room. It wasn't just the physical resemblance that haunted him. It was the timing, the circumstances, the way the universe seemed to have dropped this boy into his life without warning. After 3 years of living with the unbearable void left by Alex's death, David had learned to function, to bury his grief beneath layers of routine and responsibility. But now, it felt as if the wound had been ripped open again. By the time the morning sun began to filter through the hospital windows, David found himself standing outside the boy's room, his hand hovering over the door handle. The boy was still unconscious, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The necklace gleamed in the soft light, a tangible link to a past David had tried to move on from. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. He had no idea what answers he was searching for, or if he was ready to find them. But one thing was certain. This boy, whoever he was, had just changed David's life forever. The awakening. The sterile hum of the hospital room filled the air as sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting striped shadows on the walls. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound accompanying Dr. David Marshall as he stood at the foot of the hospital bed. The boy stirred. At first it was just a twitch of his fingers, then a flutter of his eyelids. David's breath caught, his pulse quickening. For hours, he had been replaying the scene in the ER, the moment when this boy had arrived, clinging to life, the shock of seeing his face, and the impossible discovery of the necklace. He had spent the last few hours going over every logical explanation, but none made sense. Now the boy was waking up, and with him, the potential answers to the questions that had plagued David all night. The boy's eyes opened, unfocused at first, squinting against the daylight. He groaned softly, raising a hand to his head. "You're in the hospital," David said, his voice soft but steady. He took a cautious step forward, observing every flicker of emotion that crossed the boy's face. "You were brought in last night after being found unconscious in Grant Park. We treated you for a suspected overdose." The boy blinked at him, his expression clouded with confusion and wariness. His dark eyes, so eerily similar to Alex's, narrowed slightly as they locked onto David's face. "Who are you?" The boy rasped, his voice hoarse and strained. His hand instinctively went to his neck, clutching at the silver necklace. "I'm Dr. Marshall," David replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed and sitting down. "I was the one who treated you last night. Do you remember anything about what happened?" The boy's brow furrowed as he tried to piece together his fragmented memories. I don't know," he said finally, his voice laced with frustration. "Everything's blurry." David nodded, leaning back slightly to give the boy space. "That's okay. It's not uncommon after a trauma like this. What's important is that you're stable now, and we'll work on helping you figure everything out." The boy's grip on the necklace tightened. "How long have I been here?" "Since about 1:30 a.m. It's mid-morning now," David said, glancing at his watch. "Do you have a name? Someone we can contact?" The boy hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Jake," he said finally. "Just Jake." David noticed the defensiveness in Jake's posture, the way he hunched his shoulders and avoided direct eye contact. He had seen it before in troubled teens, kids who had been through too much, who had learned to protect themselves by keeping others at arm's length. "Jake," David repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It felt both familiar and foreign, much like the boy himself. "Do you have family, Jake? Someone who might be looking for you?" Jake shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. "No," he said firmly, his voice sharpening. "There's no one." David's chest tightened at the bluntness of the response. There was no hesitation, no glimmer of hope that someone might care. It was the kind of answer that spoke volumes about the life Jake had lived, one marked by isolation and abandonment. "All right," David said gently, deciding not to push further for now. "Let's focus on getting you well. You've been through a lot." Jake's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to David. Am I in trouble? No, David assured him, his tone firm. You're not in trouble. Our job is to help you, not to judge you. Jake's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before dropping to his lap. His fingers continued to toy with the necklace, the motion almost compulsive. David leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding as he broached the subject that had haunted him all night. That necklace, he began carefully, gesturing to the chain. It's unique. Where did you get it? Jake's body stiffened instantly, his eyes flashing with suspicion. Why? He asked, his voice sharp and defensive. What does it matter? I'm just curious, David said, doing his best to keep his tone casual. I've seen one exactly like it before. Jake's jaw clenched, his grip on the pendant tightening. It's mine, he said, his voice low but firm. I've had it for years. David nodded slowly, his mind racing. Years. That was impossible, or at least it should have been. The necklace had been buried with Alex. David had made sure of it. The memory of that day was etched into his mind, as vivid as the day it had happened. All right, David said finally, sensing that pushing further would only make Jake retreat. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Jake didn't respond, his attention fixed firmly on the pendant in his hand. Hours later, after Jake had drifted back to sleep, David sat alone in his office, staring at the hospital's patient records on his computer screen. He had spent the last half hour searching for any information about Jake, but the boy was a ghost. No emergency contact, no insurance, no address, just a name and an age. 16. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to make sense of the situation. The resemblance to Alex, the necklace, Jake's guarded demeanor. It all pointed to a story that was more than coincidence. But how could he uncover the truth without alienating the boy? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Linda stepped in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, setting the cup on his desk. David gave a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I have. Linda frowned, pulling up a chair beside him. Is this about the boy? David hesitated, then nodded. It's complicated, he admitted. There's something about him, Linda. Something I can't explain. Linda's expression softened. She had worked alongside David for years, long enough to know the toll that losing Alex had taken on him. You think there's a connection, don't you? She asked gently. I don't know what to think, David confessed, his voice heavy with emotion. But I can't shake the feeling that he's here for a reason, that I'm supposed to help him. Linda reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Then trust your instincts, she said. You've always had good ones. David nodded, though the weight of uncertainty still pressed heavily on his chest. As he stared out the window at the fading afternoon light, he made a silent vow to himself and to Alex. Whatever the truth was, he would uncover it. And no matter what, he would do everything in his power to give Jake the second chance he deserved. Threads of the past. The steady rain drummed against the hospital windows as Jake stared at his reflection in the glass. His face, pale and gaunt, was framed by unkempt dark hair that fell into his eyes. The silver necklace around his neck gleamed faintly in the dim light, its weight a constant presence, both comforting and suffocating. He touched the pendant absently, his thumb running over the engraved words. Always with you. The phrase had become a mantra during the darkest moments of his life, a reminder of something he couldn't quite place but couldn't let go of either. Behind him, Dr. Marshall cleared his throat. Jake, how are you feeling today? His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone Jake had learned to distrust over years of navigating foster homes and social workers. Jake turned, his expression guarded. Fine, he said shortly, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't like the way Dr. Marshall looked at him, like he was a puzzle to be solved. Dr. Marshall nodded, stepping further into the room. He held a clipboard in one hand, but his attention was entirely on Jake. "That's good to hear. You gave us quite a scare the other night. I just wanted to check in and see if you remembered anything else about what happened." Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I already told you. I don't remember," he said, his tone defensive. Dr. Marshall studied him for a moment before setting the clipboard on the table. "All right," he said. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Jake didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the windows. Later that evening, Jake sat cross-legged on the hospital bed, a notebook open on his lap. He had found it in the drawer of the bedside table, along with a stubby pencil that barely had any lead left. Drawing had always been an escape for Jake, a way to quiet the noise in his head and make sense of the chaos around him. He sketched the view from the window, the rain-soaked city skyline, the shadowy outlines of trees in the park below. His strokes were quick and precise, each line a small act of control in a world that often felt uncontrollable. As he worked, the door creaked open, and Dr. Marshall stepped inside. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes flicking to the notebook in Jake's lap. "You draw?" he asked, his voice light with curiosity. Jake stiffened, closing the notebook quickly. "Sometimes," he muttered, tucking it under the pillow. Dr. Marshall smiled faintly. "My son used to draw too," he said, leaning against the wall. He wasn't very good at it, but he loved it. Said it helped him think. Jake glanced at him, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Your son?" "Alex," Dr. Marshall said, his voice softening. "He passed away a few years ago. Car accident." Jake didn't know how to respond. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching against the blanket. "Sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Marshall nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "It's all right," he said. "It's just, when I saw you the other night, I thought I was seeing him again. You look so much like him." Jake froze, his mind racing. He didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process the weight of someone else's grief being projected onto him. He reached for the necklace again, clutching it like a lifeline. Dr. Marshall noticed the gesture, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That necklace," he said carefully. "It's identical to one I gave Alex." Jake's grip tightened on the pendant. "It's mine," he said quickly, his tone defensive. "I've had it for years." "I believe you," Dr. Marshall said gently, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not accusing you of anything. It's strange, that's all. I thought the necklace was buried with Alex." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like a cornered animal, every instinct screaming at him to run. But there was nowhere to go, no escape from the questions that seemed to loom over him like a storm cloud. "I don't know where it came from," he said finally, his voice trembling. I'd always had it." Dr. Marshall studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, stepping back toward the door. "All right," he said. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." That night, Jake lay awake in the dark, his mind churning with memories he had tried so hard to suppress. He thought about the foster homes, the endless cycle of being shuffled from one place to another. He thought about the nights he had spent alone, clutching the necklace and whispering its inscription like a prayer. "Always with you." He didn't know why the words mattered so much, but they did. They were the only connection he had to a past he couldn't remember and a future he couldn't imagine. As the hours ticked by, Jake made a decision. He didn't trust Dr. Marshall, not fully, but he couldn't deny that the man seemed genuinely interested in helping him. And if there was even a chance that the doctor could help him find answers about the necklace, about who he was, it was worth the risk. When morning came, Jake sat up in bed, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the day would bring, but he was tired of running from the questions that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. It was time to face them head-on. A bridge to the truth. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm stripes of light on the sterile walls of the hospital room. Jake sat at the small table by the window, staring at the untouched tray of breakfast in front of him. He poked half-heartedly at the eggs, his mind far from the bland food. The events of the past 2 days lingered in his thoughts like a persistent fog. Dr. Marshall's questions, the necklace, and the uncanny resemblance to his son. Jake had spent the better part of the night wrestling with a decision. He didn't trust easily. Years of bouncing between foster homes had taught him to build walls thicker than most. But there was something different about Dr. Marshall. The man's questions weren't prying or accusatory. They were laced with something Jake rarely encountered, genuine care. He was tired of carrying the weight of unanswered questions alone. The soft knock at the door pulled Jake from his thoughts. Dr. Marshall entered, carrying a thin file folder. His white coat rustled as he moved to the small chair across from Jake, setting the folder on the table between them. "Morning," Dr. Marshall said, his voice calm and unassuming. "Morning," Jake mumbled, his eyes flicking to the folder. Dr. Marshall leaned back slightly, giving Jake space. "I wanted to talk to you about something, but only if you're comfortable." Jake's fingers tightened around the fork in his hand. "What is it?" Dr. Marshall gestured toward the necklace around Jake's neck. "I've been thinking about this a lot. That necklace, it means something to you, doesn't it?" Jake hesitated, his fingers instinctively reaching for the pendant. "Yeah," he said softly. It's all I've got." "Do you remember where you got it?" Dr. Marshall pressed gently, his tone more curious than intrusive. Jake looked away, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to admit how little he remembered about his early years. The gaps in his memory felt like missing pieces of a puzzle he could never complete. "I found it," he said finally, "a long time ago. In some pawn shop. I don't even remember where." Dr. Marshall's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition flashing in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "Jake, I think it might have belonged to my son. I gave him a necklace exactly like that when he was 15. It was buried with him after he passed." Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and confusion. "What? No, that's not possible. It's mine." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Dr. Marshall said quickly. "But there's something here, something connecting us. I don't think it's a coincidence that you ended up in this hospital, with that necklace, looking the way you do." Jake pushed back his chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "You think I stole it, or something?" "No," Dr. Marshall said firmly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying there's more to this story, more to your story, and I want to help you figure it out." Jake stood, pacing the small room, his emotions a volatile mix of fear, anger, and desperation. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've been through." "You're right," Dr. Marshall said, keeping his tone calm. "I don't know everything. But I know what it's like to lose someone you love. I know what it's like to feel like the world's moved on and left you behind." Jake stopped pacing, his back to Dr. Marshall. The man's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Slowly, Jake turned to face him, his defenses crumbling just enough to let a sliver of vulnerability show. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I see a kid who deserves answers," Dr. Marshall said simply. "And because you remind me of my son. Not just in how you look, but in your strength. You've been through a lot, Jake. You're still here. That says something." Jake swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He didn't know what to say, the words caught in a tangle of emotion. Finally, he sank back into the chair, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "Fine," he said, his voice shaky. "What do you want to do?" Dr. Marshall spent the next few hours making phone calls and piecing together the fragments of Jake's past. His first stop was the social services office, where he managed to track down some of Jake's foster care records. The information was sparse, but it gave him a starting point. Jake had been abandoned at a gas station when he was 11, with no record of his parents or relatives. Later that afternoon, armed with the foster care files, Dr. Marshall and Jake drove to a quiet corner of the city, the location of the pawn shop where Jake claimed to have found the necklace. The shop, Sterling and Sons, was an unassuming building with a faded sign and dusty windows. Inside, the air smelled of aged leather and polished metal, the shelves cluttered with everything from antique watches to rusted tools. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thick glasses, greeted them with a wary smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Dr. Marshall stepped forward, holding a photo of the necklace he had taken earlier. "I'm looking for information about this necklace. It may have passed through your shop years ago." The man squinted at the photo, then at Jake, his brow furrowing. "I remember that piece," he said after a long pause. "Silver pendant, right? Engraved with something sentimental. Came in a while back, maybe 8 or 9 years ago." Jake's eyes widened. "That's when I found it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Do you remember who sold it to you?" Dr. Marshall pressed. The shopkeeper nodded slowly. "Young man, dark hair, looked like he was in a tough spot, said he needed the money. Felt bad taking it, but he insisted." Dr. Marshall's heart raced. The description matched his brother, Adam, almost perfectly. Adam had disappeared years ago, cutting ties with the family after a falling out. Could it be possible that Adam was connected to Jake somehow? "Did he leave a name?" Dr. Marshall asked, his voice trembling with urgency. The shopkeeper frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Let me check the records," he said, disappearing into a back room. Jake glanced at Dr. Marshall, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "What if we're wrong?" he asked quietly. Dr. Marshall placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "Then we'll keep looking," he said. "But I don't think we are." Minutes later, the shopkeeper returned with a tattered ledger. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a scrawled entry dated nearly a decade earlier. "Here it is," he said, pointing to the name written beside the description of the necklace. Dr. Marshall leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. The name on the page confirmed what he had feared and hoped might be true. Adam Marshall. He turned to Jake, his voice filled with both wonder and determination. "Jake," he said, his hand tightening on the boy's shoulder, "I think I know where you came from. The ties that bind." The car ride back from Sterling and Sons was cloaked in silence. Jake sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his fingers absently gripping the pendant around his neck. Dr. Marshall glanced at him periodically, his mind racing with possibilities. The name in the pawn shop ledger, Adam Marshall, was more than just a clue. It was a bridge to a past David had almost given up on, and possibly a future he never imagined. Jake broke the silence first, his voice low and uncertain. "So, this Adam guy, you think he's connected to me?" Dr. Marshall tightened his grip on the steering wheel, choosing his words carefully. "Adam was my younger brother. He disappeared almost 7 years ago. We had a falling out before he left, and I haven't heard from him since." Jake frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed the information. "What kind of falling out?" David sighed, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We argued about the way he was living his life. He was always restless, never staying in one place for too long. I wanted him to settle down, to build something stable. He thought I didn't understand him." He paused, his voice thick with regret. "He walked away, and I let him go. I didn't try hard enough to reach out." Jake studied David's profile, the man's features etched with a mixture of guilt and sadness. It was strange to see someone so human. Adults in Jake's life had always been either aloof or overbearing, but David seemed different, like he was carrying his own baggage and wasn't trying to hide it. "Do you think he could be my dad?" Jake asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. David glanced at him, his expression softening. "It's a possibility," he admitted, "but I don't want to make assumptions. We'll need to find proof." "If Adam is your father, then He hesitated, his voice catching. Then your family, Jake. You always have been. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake looked away, his grip on the necklace tightening. Family. It was a word that felt foreign, almost meaningless, after years of being passed around the foster system. Could this really be true? Could he have a place where he belonged? Back at the hospital, David began the painstaking process of piecing together Adam's trail. He sifted through old records, contacted former colleagues, and even reached out to social services to see if they had any leads on his brother. Meanwhile, Jake spent most of his time in the art studio David had set up for him at home. The room, filled with sunlight and scattered supplies, became his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in sketches and paintings. One evening, David found Jake hunched over his desk, his pencil moving furiously across the page. The room was quiet, save for the soft scratch of graphite on paper. "That's incredible," David said, stepping closer to admire the drawing. It was a portrait of a young man with sharp features and intense eyes, a face that bore an unmistakable resemblance to both Jake and David. "Is this?" Jake nodded, not looking up. "I think it's him. Adam. I've never seen a picture of him, but I feel like I know his face." David's chest tightened. The likeness was uncanny, as if Jake had pulled the image straight from the depths of his subconscious. "You're talented," David said quietly. "You've captured something more than just a face here." Jake shrugged, his fingers smudged with charcoal. "It's just a drawing." "It's more than that," David insisted, his voice gentle. "It's a connection." The breakthrough came 3 days later when David received a call from an old friend in social services. "We found something," the woman said, her tone laced with caution. "It's not much, but it's a start." David listened intently as she explained that Adam had been in contact with a woman named Maria Reynolds shortly before his disappearance. Maria had given birth to a son around the same time Jake was born, but the records were incomplete. The trail went cold when Maria left her last known address, leaving the boy behind. "Jake," David said later that evening, sitting across from him at the dinner table, "I think we're close to finding some answers. But I need to ask you something that might be hard." Jake's gaze was wary, but he nodded. "Okay, do you remember anything about your mother, or anyone who might have taken care of you when you were little?" Jake frowned, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "Not really," he said after a long pause. "It's all a blur. I remember moving a lot. Different houses, different people. But no one stayed. Not really." David's heart ached at the boy's words, the rawness of his admission. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." Jake looked down, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. "What if we don't?" he whispered. "What if there's nothing to figure out?" David reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Jake's. "Then we make something new. You're not alone in this, Jake. Not anymore." The following day, David and Jake set out for Maria's last known address, a dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The house itself was in disrepair, its windows boarded up, and the front yard overgrown with weeds. As they approached the front door, Jake hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. "What if this is a dead end?" he asked, his voice trembling. David placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Then we keep looking," he said, "but we have to try." The door creaked open under David's knock, revealing a dark, empty interior. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and dust. They moved cautiously through the house, searching for any clues that might shed light on Maria's life, or Adam's. In a back room, they found an old dresser filled with faded photographs and yellowed papers. Jake rifled through the items with trembling hands, his breath hitching when he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "Look," he said, holding it out to David. David unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the shaky handwriting. It was a birth certificate, the edges frayed with age. His breath caught as he read the name printed at the top, Jacob Reynolds Marshall. He turned to Jake, his voice thick with emotion. "This is you," he said. "Your middle name. It's Marshall. Adam. He's your father." Jake stared at the paper, his hands trembling. For a moment, he didn't speak, his mind struggling to process the weight of the revelation. Then, slowly, he looked up at David, his eyes filled with something fragile and hopeful. "I have a family," he said, his voice breaking. I really have a family." David pulled Jake into a tight embrace, his own emotions spilling over. "Yes," he said, "you always have. And I'm going to make sure you never feel alone again." David held Jake for a moment longer, his own emotions teetering on the edge. When they finally pulled apart, Jake looked down at the birth certificate again, tracing the letters of his name with trembling fingers. "I don't even know what to say," Jake murmured, his voice thick. "All these years, I thought I was nobody. Just some kid nobody wanted." David's chest tightened at Jake's words, and he placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were never nobody," he said firmly. "You've always been someone worth fighting for, Jake. Your father, my brother, might not have been able to be there for you, but I'm here now. We'll figure out the rest together." Jake nodded, his grip on the birth certificate tightening as though it might disappear if he let it go. The dusty room seemed to shrink around them, filled with the weight of a truth that had been hidden for too long. David took a deep breath and glanced at the other items in the dresser, sifting through the collection of papers and photographs with care. Among the clutter, he found an old, faded photograph. It showed a younger version of his brother, Adam, standing beside a woman with bright eyes and a weary smile. Maria Reynolds. In her arms was a baby wrapped in a faded blue blanket. "Jake," David said softly, holding up the photo. "This is your mother, and that's Adam holding you." Jake stared at the image, his expression a mixture of wonder and sadness. "She looks tired," he said quietly, "like she was holding everything together, but just barely." David nodded, his heart heavy as he thought about the life Maria must have lived, trying to raise Jake on her own after Adam had vanished. He carefully tucked the photo into the folder he had brought along, determined to preserve every scrap of Jake's history they could uncover. "We'll take this back with us," David said. "It's part of your story, and you deserve to have it." Jake hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay," he said. "But what happened to her? Why did she leave me?" David's throat tightened at the question. He had seen enough in his career to know how complicated and painful the answers to questions like that could be. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'll do everything I can to find out." Jake's eyes searched David's face for a moment before he looked away, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his features. "What if she didn't want me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David stepped closer, his voice steady and full of conviction. "Jake, whatever her reasons were, they don't define your worth. You're here now, and you're part of this family. That's what matters." Jake swallowed hard, nodding again as he clutched the birth certificate to his chest. The weight of his past was still there, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that it might not crush him. Back at David's house, Jake retreated to his art studio, the birth certificate and photo tucked carefully into a sketchbook. He sat at the desk, staring at the blank page in front of him. His hands itched to create something, to channel the storm of emotions whirling inside him. But he wasn't sure where to start. After a moment, he picked up a pencil and began to draw. The lines were rough at first, uncertain, but they quickly took shape. He sketched the image of his mother, her tired but kind face taking form on the page. Beside her, he added Adam, his father, strong and protective, even if only in Jake's imagination. Finally, he added himself, a small boy cradled between them, safe and loved. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was a start. Meanwhile, David sat in his study, poring over the information they had gathered. The name Maria Reynolds was a thread he intended to pull until he uncovered the full truth. He typed her name into every database he had access to, searching for anything that might provide a clue about her whereabouts or what had happened to her after she left Jake. After hours of searching, he found a recent address listed under her name, a small apartment in a neighboring town. His heart raced as he wrote it down, wondering if this might finally lead to the answers Jake needed. But as he stared at the address, a sense of dread settled over him. He knew that reconnecting with Maria could be as much a source of pain as it could be of healing. If she had chosen to leave Jake, there was a chance she wouldn't want to be found. David exhaled slowly, his decision made. He would approach Maria carefully, on his own at first. He owed it to Jake to ensure that whatever came next would protect the boy's fragile trust. The next morning, David found Jake in the kitchen, the faint smell of coffee and toast filling the air. Jake looked up as he entered, his expression guarded but curious. "I found an address for your mother," David said gently, sliding the piece of paper across the table. "It's not far from here. I thought we could go together, but only if you're ready." Jake stared at the address for a long moment, his fingers tracing the faded ink. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" David's voice was steady and reassuring. "Then we'll deal with it together. But you deserve to know, Jake. Whatever happens, he'll always have a place here." Jake's eyes met David's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of trust that hadn't been there before. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet but determined. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." As they drove toward the address, the weight of anticipation filled the car. The streets blurred past, each mile bringing them closer to answers, and possibly closure. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was less about avoidance and more about preparation. When they arrived, the apartment complex was unremarkable, a faded building with peeling paint and rusted balconies. David parked the car and turned to Jake. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice gentle. Jake hesitated, then nodded, his grip on the door handle tightening. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm ready." Together, they stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, each step a small act of courage. Whatever they found behind that door, they knew it would change everything. A door to the future. The apartment complex loomed before them, a faded structure with cracked concrete stairs and rust-streaked railings. Jake stood at the base of the stairs, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, gripping the fabric like a lifeline. The address David had found was etched into the peeling paint of the door ahead. Apartment 3B. David placed a steadying hand on Jake's shoulder. "We can take this one step at a time," he said gently. "If you want to leave at any point, just say the word." Jake nodded stiffly, his eyes fixed on the stairs. "I've come this far," he muttered, more to himself than to David. "Might as well see it through." They climbed the steps together, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. When they reached the door to 3B, David paused, glancing at Jake for confirmation. The boy swallowed hard and gave a single nod. David knocked. The sound was sharp and hollow, and for a long moment, there was no response. Jake's shoulders tensed, and David could see the boy preparing for the worst, for the door to remain closed, for the person on the other side to turn them away. But then, the faint shuffle of footsteps came from inside. The sound grew louder, and the doorknob turned slowly. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a woman in her late 30s. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes weary but sharp. She looked at them with a mixture of caution and confusion. "Yes," she said, her voice guarded. "Maria Reynolds?" David asked, his tone calm but steady. Her eyes flicked between them, narrowing slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Dr. David Marshall," he began. "This is Jake. We believe you may have some connection to him." At the mention of Jake's name, Maria's expression shifted, her gaze locked onto the boy, and a flicker of recognition passed through her eyes. For a moment, She looked as though she might bolt, but then she exhaled sharply and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said reluctantly, stepping aside. The apartment was small and cluttered, with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of old coffee lingering in the air. Maria gestured for them to sit on the worn couch while she perched on a chair across from them. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her eyes darting to Jake as though she couldn't quite believe he was there. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice strained. David glanced at Jake, silently asking if he wanted to speak. When Jake didn't respond, David took the lead. "We've been trying to piece together Jake's past," he explained. "He was abandoned as a child and ended up in the foster system. He has no memory of his early years, but we found records linking you to him." Maria's face tightened, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. "That was a long time ago," she said. "I don't know what you expect me to say." Jake finally spoke, his voice trembling but firm. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his eyes locked on hers. "Why didn't you want me?" Maria flinched as though the words had struck her. She looked away, her jaw clenching. "It wasn't like that," she said quietly. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Jake pressed, his voice rising. "Because I've spent my whole life wondering what I did wrong. Why no one stayed. Why no one cared." Tears welled in Maria's eyes, and for a moment, she looked as though she might break under the weight of his words. She drew a shaky breath and met his gaze. "I did care," she said, "more than you'll ever know. But I wasn't enough. I couldn't give you what you needed. Your father, Adam, he was gone, and I was drowning. I thought you'd have a better chance without me." Jake's hands clenched into fists on his lap. "You thought dumping me at a gas station was giving me a better chance." Maria winced. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she said, her voice breaking. "I was supposed to find someone to take you, someone who could give you a real home. But I panicked. I made the worst decision of my life, and I've regretted it every day since." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavily in the air. Jake looked away, his jaw tight, as he tried to process her words. David watched him carefully, ready to intervene if necessary, but he knew this was a moment Jake needed to face on his own. After a long pause, Jake spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Did you even try to find me?" Maria's shoulders slumped, and she shook her head. "I didn't know how," she admitted. "I was too scared, too ashamed." Tears streamed down Jake's face, but he didn't try to wipe them away. "You could have tried," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You should have tried." Maria reached out as though she wanted to comfort him, but then she stopped, her hand falling back into her lap. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. I'm so sorry, Jake." The drive back to David's house was quiet, the tension in the car almost palpable. Jake stared out the window, his face a mixture of anger, sadness, and something else, something David couldn't quite place. "You okay?" David asked gently as they pulled into the driveway. Jake shrugged, his expression guarded. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I'm glad I met her, but it's a lot." David nodded, understanding. "Take your time," he said. "You don't have to figure it all out right away." Jake hesitated, then looked at David. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For everything." David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Anytime, Jake, your family. That's what we do." Later that night, Jake sat in his art studio, the photo of his parents and the birth certificate spread out in front of him. He picked up his sketchbook and began to draw, his pencil moving quickly and deliberately across the page. When he finished, he sat back and studied the image, a family portrait of sorts, with his mother, his father, and himself standing together. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't entirely real, but it felt right. For the first time, Jake felt like he was beginning to understand where he came from and where he belonged. In the next room, David sat at his desk, staring at the photo of his brother. He knew there were still unanswered questions, still pieces of the puzzle left to find. But for now, he was content. Jake was home, and they had a chance to build something new together. A family. Jake stared at the sketch for a long time, his pencil resting in his hand. The drawing was more than an image. It was a reflection of his past, his pain, and a tentative step toward a future he hadn't dared to dream of. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, but for the first time, he felt like he had something to hold on to. A quiet knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice soft. David stepped into the studio, his gaze landing on the sketch. A smile touched his lips. "That's beautiful," he said. "You have a real gift, Jake." Jake looked down at the drawing, a small smile flickering across his face. "It's just a start," he said. "I don't know what it means yet." "It doesn't have to mean everything right now," David replied, pulling a chair closer. "Sometimes it's enough just to begin." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day hanging between them. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice hesitant. "Do you think she meant it? That she's sorry?" David nodded slowly. "I think she did. Regret can be a heavy thing to carry, Jake. It sounds like she's been carrying it for a long time." Jake frowned, his hands fiddling with the edge of the sketchbook. "I don't know if I can forgive her," he admitted. "Not yet." "And that's okay," David said. "Forgiveness isn't something you have to rush. It's something you do for yourself, when you're ready. Not for anyone else." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal?" David smiled gently. "What's normal, anyway?" he asked. "You've been through a lot, Jake. It's okay to feel like it's a process. But you're not alone anymore. You've got me, and you've got a whole future ahead of you to figure out what your version of normal looks like." Jake looked at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For everything." David reached out and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Jake. We're family. That's what we do." In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Jake continued to explore his art, filling his sketchbooks with images that captured his journey, portraits of his mother, his father, and even David. His drawings became a way to process his emotions, a bridge between the boy he had been and the young man he was becoming. David, for his part, found a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent years going through the motions, his grief for Alex weighing heavily on him. But now, with Jake in his life, he felt a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't change the past, but he could help shape the future, for Jake, for himself, and for the family they were building together. One sunny afternoon, David and Jake stood side by side in the backyard, setting up an easel under the shade of a tree. Jake had decided to try his hand at painting, and David was happy to lend a hand, even if his own artistic skills were questionable at best. "You know this is going to be a disaster, right?" David said with a laugh as he fumbled with a paintbrush. Jake grinned, a rare but genuine expression. "Yeah, probably," he said. "But it'll be fun." They spent the afternoon splattering paint and laughing, the yard quickly turning into a colorful mess. By the time they finished, they were both covered in streaks of blue, green, and red, their laughter echoing through the air. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch steps, sipping lemonade and admiring their work, a chaotic, vibrant canvas that looked more like a burst of energy than anything resembling a traditional painting. "It's terrible," Jake said, his voice filled with humor. David chuckled. "It's perfect," he said, "because we made it together." Jake looked at him, his smile fading into something softer, more introspective. "Do you think Alex would have liked me?" he asked suddenly. David's chest tightened, but he didn't hesitate. "I think he would have loved you," he said. "He had a big heart, just like you, and he would have been so proud to call you family." Jake nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I think I would have liked him too," he said quietly. They sat in silence as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, the world around them settling into the calm of evening. For the first time in years, David felt a sense of peace, a feeling that despite the losses and the pain, life still held moments of beauty and connection. Jake leaned back against the porch railing, his silver necklace catching the last rays of sunlight. The words engraved on the pendant, "Always with you," seemed to glow softly, a reminder of the ties that bound them all together. As the stars began to appear overhead, Jake glanced at David, a small but genuine smile on his face. "I think I'm gonna be okay," he said. David smiled back, his heart full. "Yeah," he said, "I think we both are." And for the first time, they both believed it.